She had no other way of providing for herself without her son. So when Jesus sees this scene, his compassion is not for the dead man, but his compassion is for the woman who's truly bereft. The word compassion is a very powerful word. Our word compassion breaks down into and passion or suffering. So when we experience compassion, we are suffering with. We are sharing in the suffering of another. We are going alongside another in their suffering. In Greek, the language used when it speaks of Jesus being moved or deeply moved or moved with compassion actually refers to the guts. To the guts. He felt it in his guts. And perhaps you know what that's like when you feel that, when you hear really bad news, shocking, sad news, or you experience the pain of another, you can it almost takes your breath away sometimes. And you feel that contraction in your own body. The Hebrew and Arabic words, the Semitic words for compassion, are both related to the womb. So when you feel compassion for your neighbor, you are going back to the womb, and you are understanding that we all come from the same source. Or perhaps another way to think about it is that you are taking that person into yourself and understanding the ways in which we are intimately connected, like family, as intimate as that we are of one blood, that we are of one body. The Desmond Tutu, former Archbishop of South Africa, speaks of Ubuntu, an understanding that I am because you are. In Islam, 143 out of 144 chapters of the Quran begin with, in the name of Allah, the compassionate and merciful. 133 out of 134 chapters. So that the essential quality of God, as proclaimed in the Quran, is compassion. And mercy being the active response to the feeling of compassion. Mercy being what we do when we feel in our guts the suffering of another person. In Buddhism, there's a great story about one of the Buddhist disciples coming to him and saying, "Isn't it true, Lord, that compassion is part of our practice?" And the Buddha says, no, it is not. The Buddha says, learning to express compassion and loving kindness is all of our practice. That idea that Buddhists are detached and it's all about, meditating off in some cloud. The point of all that is to come to that place of connection with everyone and to be able to have that compassion for every human being. So Jesus is moved with compassion, and he demonstrates this. He goes and touches the bear, if not the man, and makes himself unclean by doing so. I mean, totally unnecessary, as we know from the story before, where Jesus heals without touch. But it is like he is moved in his body and he becomes one of the family. He becomes one of the family, and he risks the status demotion that comes with touching a corpse, the same way the family would, and enters into their experience as he raises this man to life. And this whole story telescopes the Elijah story. The story that we heard first this morning is the story of the great prophet Elijah, who is the quintessential prophet. He's kind of the symbolic of all the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. You remember when Jesus is transfigured on the Holy Mountain, he appears with Moses and Elijah. That's the symbol of all the law and the prophets, of everything that's gone before. So Elijah is the quintessential prophet. And we hear the story of how Elijah today raises a young man back to life. And so that at the end of Jesus' story, the people are saying, oh my goodness, there's a great prophet among us. I want to spend a little time with the Elijah story too, because it is beautiful and powerful, and I think Jesus' healing is kind of a mini version. It's meant to remind you of this other text, and so I want to expand that other text just a little bit. In the story of Elijah, Elijah is this wild man at this point, think John the Baptist, living out in the desert. He's been sent, he's in hiding basically, he's running from good old Jezebel, who's out to get him. If you were here last week, if you heard the last episode, he had humiliated her prophets on Mount Carmel and demonstrated the Baal was powerless and really ticked her off. And so he's on the lam now, and he's out in the desert, and the birds are feeding him, and it's this great story. The whole sequence is so amazing. Anyway, so then the Spirit drives him out of the desert to this widow at Zarephath. And it's important to know that this is not a widow of Israel. This is a widow of the same ethnic background as Jezebel. So she's kind of the counterpoint to the wicked queen. She is the poor, suffering person who has experienced the wickedness of the queen. She's living in a time of famine with no resources. In fact, to the degree that when Elijah asks her for a bit of bread, she says, well, that would be my last morsel. Do you want that? And he says, trust me. That's a pretty wild interaction in and of itself. She says, by the name of your God, Yahweh, this is all I got. And I was just about to lay down and die. So she goes for it. What does she have to lose? And she trusts him. And she lets him into her home. And she offers him her last hospitality, the last possible gesture of hospitality she has. She gives to the stranger. Does that remind you of anything? I mean, I hear echoes of the Good Samaritan in that crossing the boundary to care for the stranger. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there are three categories of persons who exemplify human need: the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And here we have a trinity: the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And they are in mutual hospitality. They are in mutual need. This stranger comes in out of the desert hungry. And though God has provided for Elijah all the while, this is how God is going to provide for Elijah now, if Elijah is to eat. And she makes herself vulnerable to her last bite of food to provide for him. And then the miracle happens, right? And the bread continues to be provided day after day after day. They make Eucharist together with trust, with thanksgiving, with mutual blessing. And this widow provides a hospitality to a prophet. And no longer a stranger, he becomes a householder and lives with her for years to come. And then the story turns sour once again when her only son, the one who would provide for her in her later years, the one she would be putting all of her hopes in, when Elijah has blown on wherever the Spirit would take him, when her only son becomes ill and dies. And Elijah, there's this wonderful wrangling with God. You can see the moment of desperation. 3 times he prostrates himself on the body of this child. 3 times. That's not just, turn around 3 times. 3 is a magic number. They're also telling you that he was not giving up. I mean, after you'd done it once, wouldn't you say, okay, I guess God's not going to hear? Not Elijah. He says, you're going to hear this. You're going to hear this from me. She went all the way for me. You need to go the distance for her. And the child rises. This is a story about what compassion really looks like, because it is mutual. We I think erroneously of compassion as looking down, as I look down from this pulpit, of seeing someone as being less than ourselves. But compassion, as it's revealed in its etymology and in this story, is not about lesser and greater. It is about shared humanity. It is about common suffering. And the only way we can touch it, the only way we can express it, the only way we can manifest compassion, as opposed to pity, is to have the courage to connect with our own suffering, to sit with our own experiences of loss and pain, or fear in the face of death, or desperation as our world fell apart and we were left without resources, or our shame at our failures or our foolish pride. Every one of us, I think, has such a moment when our own guts were wrenched and our eyes filled with tears and we were at a loss. And all we need to do, like Dorothy and her ruby slippers, is go back to that experience and connect with it and have the courage to be present to it in order to understand the experience of another, in order to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving neighbor as self. If we can go there, then our service to one another is not a patronizing gesture, but it is a being present. And sometimes we are being present in the midst of our own need, even at that moment. As in this story of Elijah, it was no memory. He was not remembering being hungry. He was bringing his hunger and his vulnerability. It is a beautiful story, too, for us to consider this act of compassion, to understand that we never know when we will be showing hospitality to prophets. We never know when, by our risking of generosity, we are opening the door to a miracle. That's the way God's crazy economy works. We cannot anticipate what will come of the relationship that we allow ourselves to have with the one who presents with a need. What stranger, what hungry prophet will bring us blessing next? I'm thinking about the stranger and the hungry prophet who comes to us in the form of San Esteban Preschool. I'm thinking about how we're being invited into new relationship with people who are not exactly from the same place that most of the people in this room are from. But we are getting an invitation into relationship and into hospitality, to take the risk of sharing our resources, perhaps even sacrificially, in order to make a miracle take place. No, not make. In order to make room for the miracle that God intends to take place. We don't know what that miracle is. Jesus. We can't predict that. We're not in control of it. Though we can certainly ask with all our hearts, as Elijah did. But we can make ourselves available for blessing and for healing and for transformation, for the restoration of children. I think about that metaphor of this raising of the child. You know, this used to be a place full of children. And we had a preschool, a beautiful preschool called Sunflower, and some of the adults in our midst remember their children being raised there, and on some Sundays you would know children. Well, this Sunday, there's a couple who actually participated in that school. Yes, I want to see back there too.
This is too tight.
Is this the raising of our children?
Sit up.
In a new form, in a new way? Are we being invited to serve and to welcome a prophet? And what transformation will result from that? It's an adventure. It's an adventure. So today I invite us all to look for those unlikely prophets in our lives, to look for those who present with need and bring a gift, and invite us to touch our compassion and become more aligned to ourselves and to the God of resurrection who is at work in us all. Amen.
Amen.